She walked away from the most dangerous man in the city, and he let her. For 5 years, Zariah Coleman was invisible. She ran his empire from the shadows. Every secret, every encrypted file, every blood-soaked decision passed through her hands first. She was the woman who kept Damien Varick's world from burning down, and he never once truly looked at her. Until tonight. Until she put on that green dress and walked toward the door, and when he tried to stop her, she didn't flinch. She left him standing there, speechless, in his own kingdom. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment the most feared man in the city realized he had already lost something he never knew he needed. Welcome back, everyone. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found us. This story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit down, because this one does not slow down. The Ashcroft Global Holdings building didn't sleep. It breathed, a slow, calculated exhale of recycled air and fluorescent light that never quite mimicked anything natural. On the 42nd floor, where the carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps and the windows looked out over a city that had long since stopped surprising anyone, Zariah Coleman had built her entire existence inside a 10-by-12 office adjacent to a man she would never fully understand. It was 6:47 on a Friday evening. Most of the floor had cleared out by 5. The junior analysts, the marketing coordinators, the administrative staff who actually had somewhere to be. They'd packed their bags and slipped into the elevator with the practiced relief of people escaping something they couldn't name. Zariah had watched them go through the glass partition of her office, the way she watched most things, quietly, without expression, cataloging everything. She was still at her desk. This was not unusual. In 5 years, it had never been unusual. Her inbox held 17 unread emails, 3 of which required encrypted responses before Monday morning. A courier was scheduled to arrive at 8 with physical documents that couldn't be digitized. And somewhere on her hard drive, buried beneath 14 layers of password protection, lived a file she hadn't opened in 6 days but thought about constantly. A file that detailed shipping manifests for cargo that was never, under any circumstances, supposed to exist on paper. Zariah knew what was in those ships. She had always known. She'd learned early that working for Damien Varick meant understanding that certain questions didn't get asked out loud. You absorbed information the way you absorbed bad weather. You acknowledged it, you prepared for it, and you kept moving. She closed the inbox without responding to any of it. For a long moment, she just sat there, both hands flat on the desk, feeling the cool surface of the glass underneath her palms. The office hummed. The city pressed against the windows 42 floors below. And somewhere behind the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall, Damien Varick was finishing a meeting that had been running for 3 hours with men whose names did not appear on any employee roster. Zariah exhaled slowly through her nose. Then she stood up, walked to the small private bathroom adjoining her office, and locked the door. The dress was hanging on the back of the door. She'd brought it in that morning folded inside a garment bag, which she'd carried through the lobby with the confidence of someone transporting quarterly reports. Nobody had asked. Nobody ever asked Zariah Coleman anything that didn't directly relate to Damien Varick's schedule. The dress was emerald green, deep, saturated, the kind of color that didn't apologize for itself. She'd bought it 3 weeks ago on a lunch break she'd technically not been supposed to take, standing in a boutique on Calloway Street with her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, running her fingers along the fabric before the saleswoman could approach and make her feel observed. She'd paid cash. She'd carried it out in a plain bag. She hadn't told anyone. There was no one to tell. She changed slowly, methodically, the way she did everything. Unzipped the back. Stepped in. Pulled it up over her hips, full hips, hips she'd spent years hiding beneath structured blazers and A-line skirts that said professional without saying anything about the woman wearing them. The dress didn't hide anything. That was the point. She'd bought it specifically because it didn't hide anything. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Zariah Coleman was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in organizational management from a school that had cost her everything she'd saved between the ages of 18 and 22. She had dark brown skin that her mother had always called deep water because it caught light differently depending on the hour. She had natural hair she usually pinned into submission, but had left out today, loose, full, curling at her shoulders. She had a body that took up space. She had a face that people routinely forgot in meetings, and remembered the moment something went wrong. She was not beautiful the way magazines described beautiful. She was the other kind, the kind that hit you later when you were already thinking about something else. She applied lipstick, a dark berry, the kind that said she wasn't asking. She gathered her coat, her bag, her personal phone, not the work phone, the other one, the one with a number she'd given to exactly 4 people in the last year, one of whom had texted her 2 days ago asking if she was still coming tonight. She'd said yes. She'd meant it. She still meant it. Zarya turned off the bathroom light, walked back through her office, and picked up her work phone from the desk. Force of habit. She set it face down, which she never did. Then she picked up her bag, her coat, and walked out the door. The hallway was empty. The overhead lights had dimmed to their after-hours setting, casting everything in a pale gold that made the carpet look expensive and the potted plants look sad. Her heels were quiet. She'd worn heels she could actually move in, another deliberate choice. And her stride was the same it always was, direct, purposeful, slightly too fast for someone who wasn't trying to get somewhere. She was 6 feet from the elevator when the mahogany doors opened. Damien Varick stepped into the hallway. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, men in dark suits who Zarya recognized by posture rather than face. They were security, but they blended into the architecture of his presence so completely that most people registered them only as an extension of him. He was mid-sentence, speaking low and fast, gesturing once with his left hand, the hand with the scar across the knuckle that he'd never explained and she'd never asked about. He stopped talking. The 2 men continued for 2 steps before they noticed he'd stopped. Then they stopped too. Damien Varick was 41 years old. He had the build of someone who had spent years doing things that required a body to function under pressure. Not gym-built, not decorative, but the kind of physical presence that communicated danger the way a storm front communicated rain. His hair was dark and slightly too long in the back, as if he'd postponed the haircut through sheer will. His jaw was set with the permanent tension of a man who hadn't truly relaxed since sometime in his late 20s. His eyes were a shade of gray that Zarya had privately categorized in the part of her brain she didn't examine too closely, as the color of a city before it rains. He was looking at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in 5 years of shared hallways and morning briefings and late-night emergencies. Not the glancing, functional look of a man assessing a resource. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they suddenly realized they'd been walking past for years without seeing. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. To Zarya, it felt like something being rearranged. Coleman. His voice was flat. Not unkind, but not particularly warm either. It never was. Mr. Varick. She kept moving toward the elevator. Where are you going? It wasn't a question. It was stated with the mild authority of someone who had never had to phrase things as questions because the answers had always been provided. Zarya pressed the elevator button. Out. There was a pause. She could hear him processing this, actually processing it, the way he processed things he hadn't expected, which was rarely, which was why she could hear it. I have the Meridian contracts coming in at 8, he said. Marcus can sign for them. I left instructions. Another pause. Longer. You have the Callaway rerouting documents to finalize them at 4. She watched the elevator number descend. 39. 38. The encrypted copies are in the secure drive. Access code is in your personal folder under the usual header. She felt him looking at her profile. Felt it the way you feel a window left open, a specific kind of draft that had a direction and a temperature. You're wearing a dress, he said. The elevator arrived. The doors opened with a soft chime. Zarya stepped inside and turned to face the hallway. Damien Varick was standing exactly where she'd left him, his 2 security shadows slightly behind him, his expression doing something she'd never seen it do before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't confusion, it was something older and more complicated than both, something that lived underneath the surface of a man who'd spent 2 decades making sure nobody could read him. Cancel whatever you have, he said. His voice had dropped half a register. I need you back here by 9. She looked at him directly. Something she'd learned not to do, not because it was forbidden, but because there was a cost to it, a particular kind of attention that came back at you afterward and kept you awake. No, she said simply. The elevator doors closed. She breathed out slowly through her mouth. Her hands were completely steady. She noted this with distant surprise. The elevator descended. Zariah Coleman had refused Damien Varick exactly once in 5 years, over a matter involving a legal deposition that would have required her to commit perjury. That time, he'd pushed back. He'd argued. He'd sent her 3 messages in 40 minutes. Eventually, he'd found another solution. This time, she didn't know what he would do. She told herself she didn't particularly care. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it. The lobby of Ashcroft Global was marble and glass, all right angles and controlled lighting, the kind of space designed to make everyone who entered feel slightly lesser by comparison. Zariah walked through it without looking at the security desk, pushed through the revolving door, and stepped out into the city. It was October. The air had that specific quality it got in the fall, cold enough to remind you that warmth was a thing that could be taken away, but not so cold that it punished you for being outside. The street was busy. People moved in the particular Friday evening rhythm of a city shaking off the work week, looser and louder than a Tuesday, not yet frayed enough for midnight. She pulled her coat tighter and raised her hand for a car. The restaurant was called Harlow and Reed. It sat on the eastern edge of the Brannock River. Not technically on the water, but close enough that if you sat near the window you could see the lights reflecting on the surface in a way that felt intentional and slightly romantic without being aggressively so. Zariah had looked it up, read 3 reviews, checked the noise level in the comments section, and confirmed they took reservations. She'd done this the same way she did everything, thoroughly, without ceremony, with the low-grade anxiety of someone who had planned so many other people's lives that planning her own felt faintly absurd. The man she was meeting was named Theodore Wynn. She'd met him 6 weeks ago at a professional development conference she'd attended on behalf of Ashcroft Global, collecting business cards and enduring panel discussions about leadership paradigms. Theodore had sat beside her during a particularly tedious lunch session and made a quiet, dry remark about the keynote speaker's repeated misuse of the word synergy. She'd laughed, which she rarely did in professional settings, and it had surprised them both. He was a financial consultant. He had an easy smile. He called when he said he would. She'd almost canceled twice. She hadn't. And now she was standing outside Harlow and Reed in an emerald dress, pulling open the door and stepping into the warm amber light of an actual Friday evening, and she was not canceling. Theodore was already there. He stood when he saw her, stood, which she noted, and the smile that crossed his face was unguarded and immediate, the kind that hadn't been practiced. Zariah. He said her name right, which most people didn't on the first try. Hi. She took off her coat. Sorry, the car took longer. You're not late. He pulled out her chair. You look, he stopped himself, started again. You look great. Thank you. She sat. She felt the dress against her back and thought, with surprising clarity, I deserve to be in this room. The waiter arrived. She ordered a glass of wine, something dry, and studied the menu. Theodore talked about his week easily, without performing, filling space comfortably without demanding she fill it back. She relaxed incrementally, the way she always relaxed, in stages, like a building being dismantled floor by floor. They talked for 20 minutes, and then something shifted. She couldn't name it immediately. It was a sensation more than a thought, the faint prickle at the back of her neck that she'd learned, over 5 years of managing Damien Varick's world, to treat with extreme seriousness. Her instincts were not decorative. They were operational, honed by years of processing information in environments where missing something could have consequences she didn't want to think about. Theodore was asking about her work. Normal enough. Except this was the 3rd time he'd come back to it, and the angle kept shifting, casual on the surface, but the questions were specific, not what's it like working for a big company specific, precise specific, structural specific. Ashcroft's logistics operation is pretty unusual, right? He said, cutting a piece of bread with the focused attention of someone not actually thinking about bread. I've heard the northern shipping routes are... Where did you hear about the shipping routes? Her voice was neutral, conversational. He looked up. His smile didn't falter, which was itself a tell. Most people, surprised by a redirect, let something flicker, a half-second of recalibration. His didn't. Industry talk, he said easily. That world's pretty small. She took a sip of wine. She set her glass down very carefully and began calculating distances. To the door, to the restroom, to the street. She assessed what was in her bag. She thought about who knew she was here. She thought about whether she'd told anyone. She hadn't, because there was no one to tell. She thought about Marcus, Damien's second in security. She had his number. She thought about calling. She thought about what it meant that she was already thinking about calling Damien Varick's people from the middle of what was supposed to be her night. She set her napkin on the table. I'm going to step outside for a... The restaurant door opened. She knew before she looked up. She knew from the particular quality of stillness that rolled through the room. The way conversations dropped half a volume, the way the maitre d' straightened, the way the ambient temperature seemed to drop 2 degrees. She'd felt it hundreds of times in 5 years. The room reacting to the arrival of someone it recognized as categorically different. Damien Varick walked in with 2 men and 1 woman. The woman was Riva, who managed his advanced security and dressed in ways that made people underestimate her, which was exactly the point. Damien's eyes swept the room with the particular efficiency of someone who had already known where everything was before entering. They found Zariah in approximately 1 second. He walked to their table. Theodore Wynn watched him approach. And something happened to his face. Not fear exactly, but the controlled reaction of someone suppressing fear, which was worse because it meant he knew what he was looking at. Damien didn't sit. He stopped beside the table, looked at Theodore for a moment, the way you look at something you already know the contents of, and then said quietly, almost pleasantly, Marcus Fell, Southeastern Regional Operative, Strand Syndicate. Cover name Theodore Wynn, established 14 months ago. Financial consultant's license purchased through a Shell LLC in Kessler County. The silence at the table was total. You've been running a social approach on my assistant for 6 weeks, Damien continued. Same register, same measured cadence. Gathering intelligence on internal shipping infrastructure, contractor relationships, and executive access protocols. Theodore, Marcus, didn't move. The Strand Syndicate's Northern Division is going to have a bad month, Damien said. I'd suggest you use the next 48 hours productively. He looked at the man for 1 more second, then looked away, which was the most dismissive thing Zariah had ever seen him do. Leave. Marcus Fell left. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of Harlow and Reed with the deliberate calm of a man choosing his remaining options. He didn't run. He didn't speak. The door closed behind him. The table sat empty between Zariah and Damien. She was very still. Her hands were in her lap. She was aware of the wine in her stomach, the cold air that had come in through the door, the fact that 18 other people in this restaurant had just watched something happen and were now doing the careful, practiced thing that people did in this city when they saw something they knew better than to remember. Damien finally looked at her directly. Are you all right? It wasn't particularly gentle. It was the question asked by someone who needed operational confirmation, who needed to know if there was damage and what kind. I'd like to go home, she said. He nodded once. Riva appeared at Zariah's shoulder with her coat, which Zariah hadn't asked for, and Zariah stood and put it on because the alternative was making a scene she didn't have the energy for. Not here. Not now. Outside, the river caught the city lights on its surface and held them. The car was a black Escalade with reinforced panels that you couldn't tell by looking. Zariah knew about the reinforced panels because she'd approved the expense authorization 2 years ago. She sat in the back seat behind tinted glass and watched the city move past and breathed steadily through her nose and did not speak. Damien sat beside her. One of the security men was up front. Riva was in a separate vehicle. 3 blocks from the restaurant, Zariah said, How long have you known about him? 5 days. A pause. I wanted confirmation before 5 days. She turned to look at him. You knew for 5 days and you didn't tell me. I needed to confirm the full scope. I was at dinner with him tonight, Damien. First name. She never used it. He registered this. She saw it register. I was sitting across a table from a Strand operative because you decided you needed confirmation. For 5 days. I had people on you the entire... I don't care. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated it. Hated the crack. Hated that her body was betraying the particular rage that came from feeling protected in a way that felt indistinguishable from being controlled. I had a right to know. I was the one sitting there. Damien was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city slid past in segments of light and shadow. "You would have walked away," he said, "and I needed him to make contact." She stared at him. "You used me," she said slowly, "as bait." "I used the situation." "Don't." Her voice was flat and cold and final. "Don't restructure what you just said into something else. You used me as bait, and you decided that without my knowledge and without my consent. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. She turned back to the window. The streets were narrowing. They were heading into the older part of the financial district, where the buildings pressed together and the lights were sparser. She noted the route automatically, the same way she noted everything. "Zariah," she said nothing. "There are things I have to tell you." His voice had changed register. Lower. Not softer exactly, but less armored. She'd never heard him sound less armored. "Things I should have—" "Not tonight." She pressed her fingers to her temple. "Whatever it is, not tonight. I want to go home and—" The explosion of sound was so sudden and so total that for 1/2 second her brain simply refused to process it. The crack of impact against the rear panel, the scream of tires, the vehicle lurching sideways as something struck the driver's side with a force she felt in her sternum. Then gunfire. Unmistakable, close, multiple sources. "Down!" Damien's hand found the back of her head and pressed her forward, his body coming over hers, and the world became the smell of his jacket and the sound of the car phone and Riva's voice coming through the security channel saying, "Contact, contact, contact north and east," and the driver accelerating hard and Zariah's heart rate going somewhere she'd never felt it go. She pressed her palms flat against the seat. She made herself breathe. Outside, the city was erupting. Inside, she was thinking 3 things simultaneously. They knew the route. They had multiple vehicles positioned, and this was not a message. This was an execution. She turned her head slightly, just enough to speak into the space near Damien's collarbone, pressed as she was beneath him, and said with complete steadiness, "The route was in the system. Someone on the inside gave them the route." She felt him go very still above her. She kept breathing. Outside, the gunfire continued. The car was still moving. She was still alive. And somewhere in the operational part of her brain that never truly stopped working, she was already thinking about who in Ashcroft Global Holdings had access to executive vehicle routing protocols. The list was short. She knew every name on it. The car didn't stop moving for 11 minutes. Zariah counted them. Not because she was calm. She was not calm. Her pulse was doing something animal and uncontrolled against the side of her throat, but because counting was the only thing her brain would let her do that wasn't panic. 11 minutes of acceleration and hard turns and the muffled percussion of gunfire that grew distant and then disappeared entirely, while Damien's weight held her pressed against the seat with a specific, deliberate pressure that said, "Stay down," without needing to say anything. When the car finally slowed, it was into a parking structure. Underground. The kind with no signage and a gate that opened before they reached it. Zariah sat up slowly. Damien moved off her immediately, like he'd been waiting for permission. He was already on the phone, not calling out, listening, his jaw set hard, his eyes running over her face with the quick, functional assessment of someone checking for damage before they could allow themselves to feel anything else. She looked at her hands. Steady. That surprised her again. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, not gentle, just rough. "No." "You're sure?" "I said no." She pulled her coat tighter and looked around. They were the only vehicle in this section of the structure. The driver, a man named Colt she'd processed the employment paperwork for 18 months ago, was already out of the car, hand on his weapon, scanning. "Where are we?" Damien said a name into the phone she didn't catch, then pulled it away from his ear. "Safe House, Brannock District." He looked at her again. "We're staying until Riva clears the perimeter." "Is Riva—" "She's fine. 2 vehicles took separate routes." He opened his door. "Come on." She didn't move immediately. She sat with her hands in her lap and her heart still doing the animal thing, and thought, with crystalline clarity. Someone in the building gave them the route. She'd said it in the car. She hadn't imagined it. And Damien had gone very still when she'd said it, which meant he'd already known, or he'd already suspected, which meant he'd been carrying another secret that she hadn't been given access to. She got out of the car. The safe house was 2 floors above the parking level, accessed through a stairwell that smelled like concrete and old machinery. The apartment itself was deliberately unremarkable. Functional furniture, covered windows, a kitchen that had been stocked with the mindless thoroughness of someone who understood that emergencies had no schedule. Zoraya took all of this in automatically, filing it, moving through the space, and assessing it the way she assessed every space she entered now, which was a habit she'd developed working for Damien Varick and had never been able to turn off. She sat on the couch, took off her heels, set them neatly beside her feet. Damien was by the window, not in front of it, beside it, a habit, talking in low, fast exchanges with Colt and one other man who had materialized from somewhere. She couldn't hear the specifics. She didn't try to. She was watching his profile and thinking about the list. The short list of people with access to executive vehicle routing protocols. She had that list memorized. She memorized everything. It was the job. There were 9 names on it. 3 of them she would have trusted with her actual life before tonight. Riva came in 22 minutes later, moving fast, her jacket torn at the left sleeve. She took one look at Zoraya on the couch, nodded once, the nod of one professional acknowledging another's survival, and went directly to Damien. Zoraya watched them talk. She could read enough body language to understand that the news was not good, but was not catastrophic. Not yet. Riva's hands moved once, a tight, controlled gesture that meant multiple, and Damien's jaw tightened by a degree that, to anyone else, would have been invisible. She'd had 5 years to learn his face. She saw everything. When Riva stepped back, Damien finally turned to Zaria fully and crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. Not beside her, across. Like he was beginning a meeting, like sitting too close might undo something in him that he couldn't afford to undo right now. Riva's team intercepted 2 vehicles, he said. 3 operatives confirmed Strand, 1 got away. Coordinated entry point was the 3rd intersection past Harlow and Reed, which means they had the route, and they had a 7-minute deployment window, which means someone inside gave them the departure time too, Zoraya said. Not just the route. He stopped. The route alone gives you geography, she continued. Her voice was flat and precise because flat and precise was what she had right now. But geography without timing means you're guessing at windows. 3 cars staged at a specific intersection with a 7-minute window means they knew what time we left and what direction we turned. That's 2 pieces of internal data, from 2 accesses or 1 access with full protocol visibility. She paused. How many people have full protocol visibility on executive vehicle dispatch? Damien looked at her for a long moment. 4. Names. Zoraya. Names, Damien. Something moved across his face. Resignation, maybe. Or the specific kind of frustration that came from being outpaced by someone you'd chronically underestimated. Colt, Riva, my chief of operations, Breyer. He stopped. And you, he said. The room was very quiet. Well, she said, it wasn't me. I know that. Do you? Yes. No hesitation, just flat, certain, unadorned. She believed him. She wasn't sure she wanted to, but she did. 5 years of reading the man told her when he was performing certainty and when he was actually certain. This was the latter. Breyer, she said. Damien said nothing. You already think it's Breyer. I think there are possibilities. Damien. She leaned forward slightly. I have routed your correspondence for 5 years. I know when you're hedging. She held his gaze. You think it's Breyer. He looked at her for 3 more seconds, then looked at the floor, which was, from him, essentially a confession. Vance Breyer had been Damien's chief of operations for 8 years. He was 6'2", silver-haired, possessed of the easy authority of a man who'd always been the smartest person in most rooms and knew it. Zoraya had processed thousands of his documents. She'd forwarded his schedule changes, booked his travel, routed his encrypted communications through the secure server that required a rotating 4-digit code she changed every 72 hours. She'd sat across conference tables from him at least 200 times. She had never liked him. She'd filed that away in the part of her brain marked not relevant because her job was not to like people. How long? She said. I've had questions for about 3 weeks. His voice had the quality of something being admitted rather than stated. financial irregularities on the northern accounts, small enough to miss in volume review, big enough to indicate a pattern once you know to look. 3 weeks. The number sat on her tongue like something bitter. I was building a case. You were building a case for 3 weeks while Breyer had full protocol visibility on my movements. She heard her own voice rising slightly and pulled it back. You knew there might be a leak. You knew I was going to that restaurant tonight. You knew the route would be logged in the dispatch system. And you said nothing to me. I couldn't tip. You couldn't tip Breyer, I understand that. The control in her voice was costing her something real. She could feel it. But you could have told me there was a potential compromise. You didn't have to give me names. You could have told me be careful, and I would have understood, and tonight might have looked different. If I told you to be careful, you would have asked why, and you don't stop asking, because I'm good at my job. The sentence came out harder than she intended. She breathed. Because being good at my job is how I've kept both of us functioning for 5 years, and you know that. And you still made a unilateral decision about my safety without giving me any of the information I needed to protect myself. Damien was quiet. His hands were between his knees, leaned forward now, and he had the look of a man who was absorbing something rather than deflecting it. Not comfortable, but not running from it either. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. I made a decision that wasn't mine to make, he said. I've been doing that. He paused. More than just tonight. Something in his tone snagged her attention in a way she wasn't prepared for. It was the more than just tonight. The way it landed with a specific weight that suggested it was carrying something heavier than tonight behind it. What does that mean? She said carefully. He looked up at her. In 5 years, she had seen Damien Varick negotiate with people who wanted him dead. She had seen him receive news of violence without visible reaction. She had watched him dismantle companies and consolidate power and make decisions that rippled through organizations like fault lines. And never, not once, had she seen him look anything like what he looked like right now. Like someone who was about to say something they couldn't unsay. The man tonight, he started. Marcus Fell, the Strand operative. What about him? There have been others. He said it simply, like he was reading from a report, like if he kept the affect flat enough it would hurt less. Over the last 5 years, men who expressed interest in you, personally, not operatives, civilians. He stopped, started again. I had them looked into. Zariah waited, and then I had them discouraged. The word discouraged was doing enormous and terrible work. The accountant you mentioned in passing 2 years ago, Daniel something, he got a call from a client pulling a major contract. The timing wasn't coincidental. He looked at the floor. The man from the fundraiser gala 18 months ago. He was up for a board position. The board received certain information about his past financial decisions. The sound in Zariah's ears was very specific, not ringing, more like a frequency, steady, high, the sound of something fundamental being rearranged. How many? She said. Zariah? How many men? He was quiet for a moment. 5. She stood up. She didn't do it dramatically. She just needed to be standing. She walked to the kitchen, 6 steps, and stood at the counter with both hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall and breathed. 5 men. In 5 years. 5 people who'd shown interest in her and then disappeared, not because they'd lost interest, not because she'd been too busy or too guarded or too entangled in the invisible machinery of another person's world, because the man she worked for had made phone calls, had deployed resources, had reached into the margins of her private life, the small, sparse margins, and systematically cleared them. You did this, she said to the wall. Every single time someone... She stopped, started again. You did this while I was working 60-hour weeks wondering what was wrong with me, whether I was... Another stop. I thought I was the problem. I thought it was something about me that made people... It was never you. I know it wasn't me. She turned. I know that now, standing here at 34 years old because you just told me. But I spent 5 years not knowing that. I spent 5 years thinking... She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth briefly. Not crying, just managing the specific pressure of this particular reality. Do you understand what you took from me? Damien had stood. He was across the room, and he was not moving toward her, which she understood was a choice. that he was standing there absorbing this because he understood that coming toward her right now would be wrong, and wrong was, apparently, something he was capable of recognizing even when he was too late. I told myself it was protection, he said, that the work you do, knowing what you know, made you a target. And I told myself that what I was doing was keeping you safe from men who might— You don't believe that, she said. That's not why. He held her gaze. Say it, she said. Say the actual reason. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wouldn't. And then he said quietly, with the flatness of a man who has run out of places to put something, because I couldn't stand the idea of someone else having access to you, any part of you. A pause. And I didn't know how to say that, so I did what I know how to do instead. Zariah looked at him for a long time, and there were things she wanted to say. Several of them were loud, and some of them were not going to survive being spoken out loud. And one of them, the one she was least prepared for, was something she was not ready to look at directly. She was a woman who dealt in information. She processed, cataloged, assessed, and responded. But there was a category of information that lived below all of that, in the part of her that wore emerald dresses and bought them in cash and had been quietly, stubbornly insisting for 5 years that she deserved something beyond this hallway, this building, this man and his world, and his gravitational pull. She didn't get to finish that thought. Damien's phone erupted. Not a call. The specific 3-pulse burst of the emergency frequency that she'd programmed herself 2 years ago. He was looking at the screen before the 3rd pulse finished. She watched his face go to stone. What? She said. He looked up. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Something terrible had been placed there in the last 4 seconds, and she had watched it arrive. Breyer took Nolan, he said. Nolan Voss. Damien's lieutenant. She knew him, had processed his contracts, managed his travel, sat across the table from him in monthly reviews. He was 29 years old. He'd come up through the organization the way most of them had, which was not clean, but he was loyal, which in this world was worth more than almost anything. They sent a message, Damien said. His voice had the quality of something being locked down, compartmentalized, sealed off the way you sealed off a room after a chemical breach. They want a digital key transfer, full access to the Northern infrastructure accounts, and the Meridian routing system. He paused. And they want the transfer verified by an executive-level authorized signatory. The word authorized signatory sat in the air between them. There were 2 authorized signatories in Ashcroft Global Holdings, with access to the Meridian routing system. One of them was Damien. One of them was Zariah. She understood immediately. She saw the full architecture of it in the space of about 2 seconds. The way a chessboard resolves not when you make the move, but when you see it, when the pattern becomes obvious and terrible. Breyer hadn't just taken Nolan to pressure Damien. He'd taken Nolan knowing that Damien would never personally walk into a controlled exchange. And so the demand for a verified signatory was, in reality, a demand for her. For Zariah. For the woman who had spent 5 years being invisible inside an empire that now wanted to use her invisibility as a weapon one final time. Well, Damien was looking at her like he already knew what she was thinking, like he could see her processing it, see the architecture resolving in her face. No, he said, preemptively, quietly. Absolutely not. She met his eyes. We find another way, he said. I go myself, we negotiate, They'll kill you, she said. They need me to verify. They don't need you at all. You walk in, you don't walk out, and they get nothing verified and they lose Nolan as a bargaining chip, which means they'll— She stopped. They planned this around me, Damien. This whole thing. Marcus Fell wasn't just intelligence gathering. This was always the end game. He was shaking his head. Someone has to go in, she said. Not you. She looked at him steadily. The woman who had spent 5 years being invisible inside the empire of the most feared man in the city. The woman who had been used tonight as bait, as a resource, as a variable in other people's equations, who had spent 5 years watching her own life being quietly managed by a man who'd turned obsession into policy. She thought about the emerald dress. She thought about the elevator. She thought about saying no and watching the doors close. Nolan will die if no one goes, she said. I know. And you can't go. I know that too. The room was very quiet. Riva had appeared in the doorway at some point and was listening without expression. Then there's only one option, Zaria said. Zariah, I'm not asking permission. Her voice was completely steady. I'm done asking permission. She picked up her heels from beside the couch and held his gaze for one long moment, long enough to make sure he understood that this was not discussion, was not negotiation, was not something he could shape or redirect or quietly manage while she wasn't looking. Tell me everything you know about where they're holding him, she said, and then tell me everything you have on Vance Breyer. Because if I'm walking in there, I'm not walking in empty. Damien looked at her for a moment that seemed to have weight and duration beyond what a moment should. Then slowly, he nodded. And outside, somewhere in the city, Vance Breyer was waiting with a dead man's patience, convinced he was holding all the cards. He hadn't yet accounted for the woman everyone had always forgotten to count. They spent 40 minutes in the safe house kitchen with a laptop, 3 printed files Riva produced from a locked case in the back room, and 2 cups of coffee that went cold before either of them touched them. Zaria sat at the table with a legal pad and a pen, actual paper, nothing digital, a habit she'd developed working with sensitive documents that had become reflex, and wrote while Damien talked. He laid out everything he had on Breyer with the systematic precision of a man who'd been holding it in a sealed compartment for 3 weeks and was now releasing it in controlled increments. Financial irregularities on the northern accounts, a pattern of after-hours access to the secure server. Not every night, not even every week, but consistent enough to constitute a signal if you were looking for one. 2 encrypted communications that Riva's technical team had partially cracked, enough to confirm external contact with a party whose communication signature matched known Strand Syndicate infrastructure. Zaria wrote it all down. She asked 4 questions. They were precise and they were sequential, and each one built on the last in a way that made Damien stop once and look at her with an expression she didn't have time to analyze. You already knew some of this, he said. It wasn't an accusation. I process the server access logs every Monday morning, she said. I flagged an anomaly 6 weeks ago and left a notation in the system for IT review. She paused. Nobody followed up. The silence that followed had a specific texture. I'll need a communication device that isn't logged to any Ashcroft system, she said. Clean, single-use capability minimum, and I need Riva to walk me through whatever building intelligence she has on the location before I go anywhere near it. Riva, leaning against the far counter with her arms crossed, said, I can give you the exterior layout. Internal configuration is speculative. Speculative based on what? Building permits from 2019, original commercial conversion documentation. Then I want to see all of it. Zaria looked at Riva directly. Everything speculative included. I'll tell you what's useful. Riva looked at Damien, a brief look, the kind that passed between 2 people with a long shared history of deferred judgments. Damien said nothing, which was, from him, authorization. They worked for another 20 minutes. When Zaria finally set the pen down and looked at what she'd written, she had 2 columns. What she knew and what she needed to know before walking into a building held by a man who had just orchestrated a convoy ambush and a kidnapping in the same evening and had not yet made a single error she could identify. The thing about Vance Breyer, the thing she kept returning to, running her thumb along the edge of the legal pad, was that he was smart. Not just operationally smart, architecturally smart. He'd spent 8 years inside Damien's organization, building something that looked like loyalty, while building something else entirely underneath it. That level of sustained deception required a particular type of intelligence, the type that was patient and structural and completely comfortable with the long game, which meant the exchange demand was not the end game. It was a door. She stared at the pad. Something was wrong with the shape of it. The demand, she said. Walk me through it again. Damien looked up from the laptop. Digital key transfer, full access to the northern infrastructure accounts in Meridian routing, verified by authorized signatory. He asked for Meridian routing specifically. Yes, not the eastern accounts, not the Callaway infrastructure. Meridian routing specifically. Damien was very still. Meridian routing is the distribution network, she said. It's not the money. The northern accounts have more liquid value by a factor of, she calculated briefly, about 8. If Breyer wanted a financial extraction, he'd demand the northern accounts. Full stop. She looked at Damien. He's not after the money. He wants the network, Damien said. Slowly, like he was catching up to something she'd already cleared. He wants the network. He wants operational control of the physical distribution infrastructure. She tapped the pad. Which means whoever he's working with doesn't need Ashcroft's money. They already have money. They need the routes, the contacts, the logistics architecture that took you how long to build Meridian? 4 years. 4 years. That's what they're buying. The keys are just the transfer mechanism. She sat back. Breyer isn't working for Strand. Or he's not only working for Strand, this is bigger. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somewhere far off, a siren moved through the city and faded. Riva said, if the network is the target, they don't need Nolan alive once the transfer is verified. Nobody said anything in response to that. There was nothing to say. Zarya picked up her pen. Then we don't give them a verified transfer, she said. We give them something that looks like one. Damien started to say something. I know the system, she said before he could. I built half the verification protocols. I know exactly what a valid transfer confirmation looks like, and I know exactly what it would take to produce one that would pass visual inspection for long enough to... She stopped, recalculated. Long enough for your team to reach Nolan before they realize it's not real. Damien leaned back. She could see him running it. Running all of it. The variables, the risks, the specific catastrophic outcomes that lived in the gap between long enough and not long enough. If they detect the false verification before we get to Nolan, they'll kill him immediately. Yes, I know. And if they detect it before Riva's team is in position, same outcome, plus I'm still inside the building. She held his gaze. I understand the math, Damien. I've been doing this kind of math for 5 years. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the thing it had done in the elevator. The thing that happened when Damien Varick encountered something he couldn't flatten into a decision matrix. Something that required him to feel something and didn't give him the option to file it elsewhere. I don't like this, he said. I know. I want to say no. I know that too. Another long moment. Riva, he said. Get the building specs, all of them. He looked back at Zarya. And you're wearing a wire, non-negotiable. She nodded once. That was fair. They left the safe house at 12:40 in the morning. The location Breyer's message had specified was a converted textile facility in the Dunmore Industrial Corridor, an area of the city that had been promised redevelopment for 15 years and had instead calcified into the specific limbo of warehouses that were too solid to demolish and too empty to use. The facility had been purchased 18 months ago through a holding company that, when Zarya had run it quickly through the financial documentation she had memorized from routine processing, resolved back to a subsidiary she recognized, a subsidiary of Ashcroft Global Holdings. Breyer had been planning this from inside the infrastructure he was dismantling, using Ashcroft's own assets to stage its destruction. She sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, not the armored Escalade, something anonymous, and thought about that, about the specific species of patience it required to work inside a thing for 8 years, to build trust and access and proximity, and to spend all of it on a single move made at a moment of your own choosing. She understood it in a way she didn't want to. She understood long-term patience. She understood building something quietly, incrementally, while the people around you looked at the surface and never looked below. The car stopped 3 blocks from the facility. Riva was in the passenger seat. She turned and looked at Zarya without particular expression. Team is in position on the eastern perimeter. They go on my signal, not before. A pause. If something goes wrong inside and I don't hear from you in 40 minutes, Zarya said. If you don't have a signal from me in 40 minutes, pull Nolan regardless. We don't have a confirmed location on Nolan inside the ground floor northeast section. She said it without hesitation. The building's original loading dock conversion put the only reinforced interior space in the northeast corner. If I were holding someone in that building and I needed them secured, that's where I'd put them. Riva looked at her for a moment. You got all of that from building permits. And from knowing how Breyer thinks. Zarya opened the car door. The night air was cold and smelled like motor oil in the river. He's systematic. He picks the most structurally logical option, and he uses it. He's been doing that for 8 years. She paused. It's also why the false verification will work long enough. He'll want it processed through proper channels, even in a controlled exchange. He thinks systematically, which means he'll need to see the system respond correctly before he believes it. She stepped out onto the street. She was still wearing the emerald dress. She'd been offered a change of clothes back at the safe house and had declined. She'd thought about it for one moment and then declined, and she understood why without examining it too closely. She was not going in there as a resource. She was not going in as a variable. She was going in as herself. The wire was a flat, adhesive strip against her ribs, beneath the dress. It transmitted to a receiver in Riva's vehicle and picked up both audio and, with less reliability, spatial acoustics. Zoraya had listened to Riva's technical explanation of its limitations and filed them precisely. She walked the 3 blocks alone. The facility's entrance, a personnel door set into the vast corrugated wall, was open when she arrived. Not propped open, not unlocked, open, waiting. She registered the deliberateness of this. An open door that you've been told to walk through is not a welcome. It's a statement of control. She walked through it. The interior was dark in the way that large industrial spaces were dark, not uniformly, but in sections, with pools of working light positioned at functional points that simultaneously illuminated and isolated. The floor was concrete. Her heels were very loud. She didn't try to soften them. There were 4 men visible. She counted them in the first 3 seconds. 2 near the eastern wall, 1 by what had been a loading platform, 1 in the shadows to her left, whose position she'd picked up not from seeing him, but from the specific disturbance of air near the wall. She filed all 4 locations, kept her breathing even, and kept walking. Miss Coleman. Vance Breyer materialized from the far edge of the lighting pool. He was dressed as she had always seen him dressed. Dark, fitted, expensive without display. His silver hair was neat. His hands were at his sides. He looked exactly like a man who had been anticipating this and was pleased to find reality matching expectation. "Mr. Breyer," she said. Her voice bounced off the concrete in a way that made her sound more alone than she was. "I have to admit," he said, stopping 10 feet from her, "I didn't expect Varric to actually send you. I thought he'd attempt something more reckless." The tone was collegial, conversational. It made her skin feel like something was moving across it. "He must think a great deal of you. Or he understands the parameters of the exchange," she said. "Where's Nolan?" "Safe. For now." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed pleasantly. "It isn't." He tilted his head slightly. "You prepared a false verification. I want to acknowledge that up front, so we don't waste time." Everything in her went very still. She kept her face completely neutral. She did not change her breathing. She did not shift her weight. 5 years of sitting in meetings where the information in the room was lethal had given her a capacity for stillness under pressure that she'd never fully appreciated until this moment. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." He said it with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this. "You're the one who built the verification protocols, Ms. Coleman. I know that because I've read every internal development document produced in the last 4 years, which took some effort but was entirely worthwhile." He smiled, a thin, controlled expression that reached nothing. A false verification would require a confirmation token pulled from the live system, which would generate a system log, which would alert the network monitor within, he glanced at his watch, approximately 6 minutes of execution. Her mind was running calculations at a speed she could feel physically. He'd known. He'd known the plan was a false verification, and he'd invited her in anyway, which meant, "You don't actually want the verification," she said. The words arrived before she'd consciously decided to say them. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, enough to confirm it. "You want me," she said, specifically. "The verification was a mechanism," he said, "to get you here." "Yes." The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the temperature of the building. She was thinking fast. Why her? Why specifically her? Breyer wanted the Meridian network. They'd established that. The verification was a pretense. But a live authorized signatory, her specifically, what did a live authorized signatory give him that a forced digital transfer didn't? What required her physical presence, her living biological identity? The answer arrived, and it was worse than anything she'd mapped at the safe house kitchen table. Biometric authorization, she said. Breyer said nothing, which was everything. The Meridian Network's highest level security layer, the one she'd helped implement 3 years ago after a security audit recommended it, wasn't digital key dependent. The digital keys were an access layer. Below them was a biometric confirmation requirement that had been added specifically because digital keys could be stolen, duplicated, coerced. The biometric layer required a live fingerprint and retinal scan from one of 2 authorized individuals. One was Damien, the other was Zariah. Breyer had never wanted a digital transfer. He'd wanted her body, her literal, living, biological confirmation, pressed against a scanner. Because the digital keys Damien could theoretically have changed or voided remotely. But a live biometric scan, once executed, locked in a 12-hour authorization window that couldn't be remotely overridden. 12 hours in which anyone with the digital keys could move through the entire network infrastructure freely. She had walked in here with a false verification and no counter for the actual plan, because she hadn't known the actual plan. "There's a scanner behind you, Ed," Breyer said conversationally. "Through the door on the left." She didn't turn to look at it. "Nolan Voss," she said. Her voice was steady. "What happens to him?" "That depends on how cooperative you are in the next 10 minutes. "He's already dead." She said it flatly, watching Breyer's face. "If you needed him to get me here and I'm already here, he's already dead, or he's going to be regardless of what I do. Because he can identify the location and the people involved, and you have no mechanism to ensure his silence that doesn't end in Zariah." Breyer's voice lost the pleasantness. Something harder came through it, something that had been waiting behind the collegiality this whole time. "Put your hand on the scanner." "No." The word fell into the concrete space and stayed there. 4 seconds of absolute silence. Then, from somewhere in the northeast section of the building, she heard a sound. It was brief. It was human. And it was the specific acoustic signature of someone in pain who'd been told to make that sound at a specific moment as a demonstration. Nolan was alive, and Breyer had just told her what keeping him alive was going to cost. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. In that second, she thought about the safe house kitchen. She thought about Damien's face when he'd said, "I couldn't stand the idea of someone else having access to you." She thought about the emerald dress and the elevator and saying no and meaning it. She opened her eyes. "I need you to understand something," she said to Vance Breyer. Her voice had changed, not louder, not angrier, but different in a way she recognized from the deepest operational moments of 5 years inside this world. The voice she used when she was past the point of managing a situation and had moved into something rawer and more fundamental. "I've spent 5 years making sure the machinery of this organization runs without friction. Every encrypted contract, every sensitive communication, every system architecture that you just explained back to me in impressive detail." She took one slow step forward. "I know where everybody is buried, literally and otherwise. I know the financial architecture, the operational structure, and I know the names of every person inside and outside this organization who has ever made a decision that could end their own life if it became public." Breyer was watching her. His hands had moved slightly. Not toward anything, just moved. "The biometric scan takes 12 hours to time out," she continued. "But the system audit that follows an unauthorized coerced scan takes considerably less time to trigger, because I built a secondary flag into the biometric layer that activates when the scan is executed outside of a pre-registered authorization window." She watched his face. "You've read the development documents. Did you read the implementation addendum?" She had no idea if she was right. She had no idea if such an addendum existed. She was constructing reality in real time, word by word, watching Breyer's face for the fracture that would tell her if she'd found the edge of what he knew and what he'd missed. There. A fraction of a second. His eyes moved left. The specific involuntary movement of someone accessing memory under stress, checking what they recalled against what they were hearing. He hadn't read the implementation addendum, or he wasn't certain whether he had. She had approximately 90 seconds before he resolved that uncertainty, and she lost the only leverage she'd found in this building. She pressed harder. "The flag routes to an external monitoring service that isn't connected to any Ashcroft internal system, which is why it wouldn't appear in documents you access through internal channels. It triggers law enforcement notification and a full network lockdown simultaneously. She kept her voice at the same register, not triumphant, not threatening, just factual. Which means the moment I put my hand on that scanner without executing a specific 12-digit override code, you don't get 12 hours of network access. You get 30 minutes before federal assets are en route to this building. Breyer was very still. How do I know you're not constructing this right now? He said. You don't, she said. That's your problem. The 4 men in the building had shifted. She couldn't see all of them, but she felt the shift. The specific reconfiguration of weight and attention that happened when a situation changed shape, and people who'd been told to wait were waiting for new instructions. Breyer looked at her for a long moment. It was the look of a man reassessing something he'd thought was complete. Running new variables through an architecture he'd believed was solid, feeling it flex in ways he hadn't engineered for. The override code, he said carefully. If you give it to me, I don't give it to you. She held his gaze. I execute it myself, in exchange for Nolan walking out of this building before I touched the scanner. Another silence. Longer. She could feel her heart rate in her fingertips. She was breathing through her nose, slow and deliberate, keeping every visible muscle in her body relaxed, while her mind was running at a velocity that felt almost painful. She needed 30 more seconds. She needed Breyer to stay uncertain for 30 more seconds, because somewhere in the eastern perimeter, Riva's team was positioned, and Riva had said 40 minutes, and they were at... She didn't know how long they'd been at. She'd lost her time reference inside the building. She was operating without a net. And then Breyer said, "Show me the override protocol. On a system I provide. If it's real, we negotiate. If it's not..." He smiled, and this time the smile was different. No pleasantness left at all. "Then we have a very different kind of conversation." He gestured to one of the men near the eastern wall, who moved toward a table she hadn't been able to see clearly in the dark. A laptop, company's standard encryption interface. She looked at the laptop. She looked at it, and she understood, with the complete clarity of someone who had run out of angles, that she had 70 seconds to either produce a security protocol that didn't exist or find the third option she hadn't identified yet. She walked toward the laptop, and in the pocket of her coat, the coat she'd kept on, had deliberately kept on, her fingers found the edge of the single-use communication device Riva had given her, the one she hadn't used yet, the one with a single pre-programmed function. She pressed the button. She didn't know if it had worked. She didn't know if the signal had cleared the building's walls. She didn't know if Riva was already moving or still waiting at the 40-minute threshold. She sat down in front of the laptop. Breyer stood behind her left shoulder. She could feel the heat of him, could feel the specific attention of a man who had planned everything and was watching the last variable resolve. She put her hands on the keyboard, and the lights went out. The darkness was total for exactly 3 seconds. Then the emergency generators kicked in and bathed the warehouse in red. Not the clean white of normal lighting. Red, the specific blood-colored emergency frequency of industrial backup systems, designed to illuminate enough to prevent fatal accidents and not enough to do much else. It turned the concrete floor into something that looked like the bottom of a drained swimming pool, and it turned every face in the building into something harder to read. Zoraya was already moving. She didn't think about it. There was no conscious decision. Her body made the calculation before her mind caught up, and she was out of the chair and sideways before Breyer's hand reached her shoulder, and she felt his fingers catch the fabric of her coat and pull. And she let the coat go, shrugging out of it in one motion, feeling the cold of the warehouse hit her arms immediately. She moved toward the dark. The pools of red light were navigational hazards, not cover. You didn't stand in them. She'd mapped the space in the first 30 seconds of entering it, the way she mapped every space, and she moved now by that internal map rather than by sight, angling away from the loading platform and toward the corridor she'd identified along the western wall. Behind her, Breyer said something she didn't hear clearly. His voice was sharp and directed and was giving instruction rather than pursuing her, which meant the 4 men were being deployed. She counted in her head. Man 1, eastern wall, 20 feet behind her current position. Man 2, loading platform, to her right. Man 3. She'd placed him near the western corridor, which was exactly where she was going, which was a problem. Man 4, shadows left, unknown current position, worst variable. She stopped moving. pressed herself against the wall, made herself breathe slowly. Through her mouth, no sound. The red light pulsed slightly. Emergency generators weren't stable. The pulse was a 3-second rhythm, just enough variation to make shadows move. She heard footsteps. Concrete carried sound efficiently, and she could differentiate. 2 sets moving parallel on her right, 1 set somewhere ahead. She couldn't find the 4th. She thought about the communication device. She'd pressed it before the lights went out. The device had one function. It sent a pre-coded burst signal to Riva's receiver that meant now, not in 40 minutes, now. Whether it had transmitted through whatever signal dampening the building might have, she didn't know. She was going to operate as if it had worked. She was also going to operate as if it hadn't. Both simultaneously. That was the job. The corridor ahead was dark in a different way. Darker than the main floor, no emergency lighting coverage, which meant it was a secondary space that wasn't on the generator loop. She moved into it, and the darkness became something physical, something she was moving through rather than just looking at. Her left hand found the wall, cold, rough, concrete block. She kept moving. Behind her, she heard the main floor come partially alive with movement and low, urgent voices. Not shouting. Briar's people were controlled, professional, strand-trained, which meant they operated in exactly the kind of tactical discipline that made them effective and slightly predictable. Predictable because trained response was patterned response. And patterns were information. She stopped at what her feet told her was a doorway. The floor changed texture slightly, a metal threshold, and pressed her back against the frame and thought very hard and very fast. Nolan was in the northeast corner. She was moving west. This was not ideal. She reconsidered the map in her head. The building's original layout, converted textile facility, 2 main processing floors connected by an internal service corridor that ran the full north-south length of the building along the eastern wall. The northeast corner was accessible from that corridor. The corridor entrance was on the main floor, on the east side, which currently had at least 2 of Briar's men between her and it. She had the wire on her ribs. It was transmitting, presumably, audio. If Riva was close enough and the signal had cleared the building, Riva knew she was mobile. Riva might also know the building had lost primary power, which was information. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and focused, listened to the warehouse. And then she heard it. From outside the building's eastern wall, distant but distinct, the specific sound of a vehicle moving fast without headlights, the kind of sound that only resolved as a vehicle if you already knew what you were listening for. Riva was coming. How far out, she didn't know. But coming meant she had a window. A small, violently temporary window that would open and close based on how fast Briar's people assessed the external threat versus the internal priority. She moved, back through the corridor, not toward the main floor. She cut left, following the wall in the dark, using her left hand as a guide and her feet as sensors, moving faster than was strictly safe because safe was not the operating parameter right now. She found another door. This one opened. She tried the handle without hesitation, and it gave, and she pushed through into a space that had slightly more ambient light from somewhere above, a grimy skylight that was letting in the city's atmospheric glow. She could see enough. Storage space, industrial shelving, mostly empty, some wooden crating stacked along one wall, and at the far end, a door marked with a rusted exit sign that pointed right, east. She moved through the storage space fast, weaving through the shelving, and reached the far door and stopped. She listened. On the other side, one person, standing. She could hear the specific stillness of someone standing alert rather than moving, the occasional shift of weight, the particular quality of held breath. Guard on the corridor. She looked at the shelving beside her, scanned it, found a section of metal rod, conduit, 2 feet long, the kind of thing left over from an electrical installation, resting at eye level. She picked it up. She thought about this for exactly 2 seconds, which was as long as she could afford. She had never hit another person in her life. She had approved security expenditures. She had processed weapons permits. She had signed off on operational reports that described physical confrontations in the sanitized language of corporate documentation. She had never been the one holding the rod. She was the one holding the rod. She opened the door. The man in the corridor was fast, faster than she'd expected, already turning before the door was fully open, hand moving toward his side. and she swung without ceremony, a lateral arc aimed at his forearm rather than his head, because she needed him down, not dead, and because she wasn't capable of the alternative, and she knew it. The rod connected with his forearm, with a crack that she felt up to her shoulder. He made a short, bitten-off sound, and the movement toward his side stopped. She was already moving past him, one foot hooked around his ankle in something she'd seen performed exactly once in a security demonstration 2 years ago, and had filed away in the part of her brain that stored everything. She pulled. His weight did the rest. He went down on the concrete, and she kept moving because stopping was not an option. The corridor was narrow, and it ran north. She ran. Her feet on concrete were loud now. No way around it. She needed speed more than quiet. The corridor was lit by a single emergency strip on the ceiling, red-orange, and it made everything look overexposed, too saturated, slightly unreal. Her lungs were starting to feel the pace. She was not a woman who had prepared for this specific physical experience, and her body was informing her of this in specific terms, but she kept running because the alternative presented itself with perfect clarity, and she did not find it acceptable. 40 feet? 60. The corridor bent slightly right, northeast, and she bent with it and saw the door. Heavy. Industrial. The kind with a crossbar latch. She hit the crossbar with her forearm at full stride, and the door burst open, and the cold air of the northeast section hit her like something physical. The space was larger than the corridor. It had been a loading dock, then a storage area, then apparently nothing for long enough that the concrete had developed cracks she could see in the emergency lighting. Along the far wall, she saw the reinforced interior space she'd identified from the building permits. A cage-style enclosure with a padlocked gate, originally designed to store controlled inventory. Nolan Voss was inside it. He was seated on the floor, wrists bound behind him, his left eye swollen, almost completely shut, his shirt torn at the collar. He looked up when she came through the door, and his one functioning eye processed what he was seeing, and something moved across his face that was too complicated to look at directly. "Coleman," he said. His voice was rough. "What the—" "Don't talk," she said, moving, scanning the space. "Where's the lock?" "Front of the cage, padlock. Breyer has the key." She was already at the gate. The padlock was combination, not key. Nolan had been wrong about the key, or guessing. She looked at it. Commercial grade, 4-digit. She tried 0000 because desperate situations sometimes rewarded the obvious. It did not reward her. "I need something to cut this or break this," she said, scanning the space. "Left wall," Nolan said. "There's a toolbox. They used it to set up the cage." She went left. Found the toolbox. Actual metal, actual tools, the kind of accumulated equipment that existed in industrial spaces and never got fully cleared out. She dug through it fast, her hands moving, fingers identifying by touch. Screwdriver, pliers, wrench. Her hands found something heavy, and she pulled it out. Bolt cutters. Old, slightly rusted at the joint, but solid. She went back to the cage, positioned the cutters on the padlock shackle, put everything she had into the handles. Her hands were shaking. She realized this and made a deliberate choice to continue anyway. The lock didn't give on the first compression. She adjusted the angle, the shackle's thinnest point, not the middle, and pressed again, her whole upper body engaging, her shoulders burning, and felt the give before she heard it. The shackle parted with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. She pulled the gate open. Nolan was already trying to get to his feet. She went in and got his arm and pulled, and he came up unsteadily. He was bigger than her by 60 pounds, and he was injured, and the geometry was difficult. But he got his feet under him. "Wrists," she said. "Back pocket." They missed a knife. She found it. Small, folding, the kind that should have been found in any competent search and hadn't been, which said something either about Breyer's people or about Nolan's ability to conceal things. She cut the zip tie, and he brought his arms forward with a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. "How bad?" she said. "I'm functional." He flexed his hands. The left one trembled. "Left hand's going to be a problem." "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then we run." She turned toward the door she'd come through, and it opened from the other side. The man who came through was not one of the 4 she'd mapped on the main floor. He was larger, broader, and he had the specific economy of movement of someone who did this professionally and had been doing it long enough that urgency and calm had become the same thing. He saw Nolan first, then Zariah, then the bolt cutters in her hand, and all of this took him approximately 1 second to process. Then he said, "Riva sent me." She didn't lower the bolt cutters immediately. "Name?" "Dex. I'm on the Eastern Entry team." He looked at Nolan. "Can you walk?" "Run," Nolan said. "She already asked." "Then we're going." Dex moved back through the door and held it. "East exit, 30 seconds. There's a van. Riva's team hit the main floor 60 seconds ago." Zariah went through the door. Nolan followed. She could hear it now shout, from somewhere on the other side of the building, the sounds of an operation in progress. Not the Hollywood version, the real version. Short, controlled, disorienting. Nothing like the movies she'd processed expense reports for Damien to attend and had never gone to see herself. The east exit was a roll door, half raised. She went under it on her knees without thinking about the dress and came up on the other side into cold air and the smell of the river and the darkness of the exterior wall. The van was there, running, no lights. She got in. Nolan got in behind her. Dex pulled the roll door closed with one hand and was in the front passenger seat before it had fully stopped moving. The van moved. Zariah sat in the back on a metal bench and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and stared at the opposite wall and let herself breathe in a way she hadn't been able to inside the building. Her hands were still shaking slightly. She looked at them like they belonged to someone she was assessing. "You came in alone," Nolan said. He was across from her, his back against the van wall, his swollen eye aimed at the floor. "Varric let you come in alone." "I didn't give him a lot of choice." Nolan made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No, I guess you didn't." A pause. "The light's going out. That was you." "I sent a signal. Riva's team must have cut the primary." "Bought you what? 2, 3 minutes?" "Enough." He looked at her. The good eye was steady and tired and held something in it that she was going to have to think about later, in a quieter moment. "Briar told me," he said, "before you got there. He told me about the plan, about using you for the biometric." "I know. He also told me—" Nolan stopped. "He told me this wasn't just Strand." His voice had gone careful. "Zariah. The people he's working with. It's not just a rival organization." "I know," she said again. "Government." He looked at her sharply. "He told you?" "He didn't have to." She watched the city move past through the van's windshield. "The Meridian network isn't worth this much risk to a criminal organization. Criminal organizations can build logistics infrastructure. It takes time and money, but it's not irreplaceable. The only people for whom Meridian's existing routes are irreplaceable are people who need legitimate cover." She paused. "Official channels that can't be seen to be building this infrastructure themselves." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" he said. "I've suspected for about 6 weeks. A pattern in the routing requests. Specific destinations flagged for priority access that didn't correspond to any commercial rationale I could identify, but they corresponded very cleanly to a federal oversight gap that was created by a regulatory amendment 18 months ago." She looked at her hands. Still. Steadier now. "I documented it. I've been documenting it. Where is that documentation?" "Somewhere Briar didn't find it," she said simply. The van slowed. She looked up and through the windshield saw the exterior of a building she recognized. Not the safe house from earlier. Different location. Damien had multiple. She'd processed the leases on most of them. Dex said, "We're here." The door opened from the outside, and Damien was there. Not waiting at a distance, not behind security, standing directly outside the van door with his jacket gone and his sleeves pushed up and the specific quality in his face that she'd never seen there before tonight, and was going to have to develop a name for eventually. He looked at her for 1 second. His eyes ran the same assessment they always did, scanning for damage, cataloging, processing, but underneath that, something that was not operational at all. "Nolan," he said, without breaking eye contact with her. "Ambulatory. Left hand needs imaging." Nolan was already getting out the far side, leaning on Dex. Damien held out his hand. Not to help her out of the van, just held it out. The gesture of someone who had run out of the language to say a thing and was offering something physical instead. She took it. She stepped out of the van onto the street. The heels were still on, miraculously. Her dress was torn at the knee from the roll door. Her arms were cold and her shoulder burned from the bolt cutter effort, and somewhere in the last 40 minutes she had run, hidden in darkness, hit a man with a metal rod, and cut through a padlock, and none of these things appeared on her job description. She was still standing. Damien looked at her hand in his, and then at her face, and she watched him do the thing she'd watched him do twice tonight. The thing where Damien Varick, who had spent 20 years being unreadable, became briefly, involuntarily readable, where something that lived below the architecture of his composure came up to the surface and stayed there. "Are you hurt?" he said. For the third time tonight, the same question. But it wasn't the same question anymore. "No," she said, for the third time, but she let him keep holding her hand. They walked inside. The second safe house was larger. It had a proper operations room, screens, communication equipment, a table large enough to function as a command surface. Riva was already there via a separate entry, standing over a laptop, her expression carrying the controlled urgency of someone managing multiple active threads. "Breyer is in the win," she said before either of them spoke. Eastern team secured 2 operatives and one of the government contacts. Mid-level, he'll talk. They always do at that tier. But Breyer moved before we had the perimeter fully closed. Zoraya sat at the table. Her body had begun to communicate its grievances systematically, and she was working through them in sequence, prioritizing. "What about the main floor engagement? Clean. No casualties on our side. 2 of Breyer's people are in medical custody. 1 declined, 1... Riva paused briefly. "1 didn't make it." The room received this information with the specific silence of people who understood what it meant and were not going to perform anything about it. "The government contact," Zoraya said. "What tier?" "Deputy director level, infrastructure oversight." She nodded. "He'll have names above him." "That's what we're working on." Riva looked at her directly. "You said you've been documenting something, Breyer and the federal connection." "Yes." "How comprehensive?" "Comprehensive enough." Zoraya looked at Damien. He was standing at the edge of the table, and he was watching her with the same particular expression. Still readable, still that unfamiliar version of him that had surfaced tonight and shown no sign of going back under. "I need a secure terminal in about 20 minutes. He pushed a laptop toward her. She recognized the encryption interface. She'd set it up. She opened it. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precision they'd moved with for 5 years. Fast, sure, the muscle memory of someone who'd spent half a decade building this architecture. "There's something you need to see first," she said without looking up, "before we decide what to do with the documentation." "What is it?" Damien said. She pulled up a file. It loaded slowly. It was deeply buried, triple encrypted, the kind of storage solution that required knowing both what you were looking for and the exact sequence of its concealment. The screen filled with information. The table went very still. "Breyer has been in contact with this group for 31 months, she said. "Not 18, not since the regulatory amendment. 31 months, which means he began this before the amendment was passed, which means he was either anticipating it or he helped draft it," Damien said. The flatness in his voice was a different kind of flat than usual, the flat of something being compressed under enormous pressure. The amendment was sponsored by a senator from the Eastern District whose infrastructure campaign was funded through a PAC that I traced through 6 shell companies to a holding entity that appears in 3 of Breyer's personal financial documents from 28 months ago. She finally looked up. "He didn't just sell your network to the government. He helped engineer the legal framework that would allow them to use it." The silence in the room had weight. It was the silence of something being understood at a scale that took a moment to resolve. Riva's hand had gone completely still on the laptop she'd been working on. Nolan, from a chair in the corner where someone had placed him with an ice pack against his left hand, was staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. Damien was looking at the screen, then he looked at her. "How long have you had this?" "I had pieces of it," she said carefully. "I've been assembling it." "How long, Zoraya?" She held his gaze. 6 weeks. The number sat between them. "You were building a case," he said. "Yes." "Without telling me." "Yes." Something moved across his face. She watched him recognize it. The mirror image of what he'd done. The architecture of the same decision, made for different reasons, but with the same fundamental shape. "I had information relevant to your survival, and I decided alone how to use it." He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. Just that. Okay. With a quality that acknowledged everything beneath the word without trying to resolve it right now. She turned back to the screen. We have enough to expose the government connection publicly if we move in the next 12 hours. After 12 hours, Breyer knows what we have, and he'll have moved to contain it. We have one window. What do you need? Damien said. Riva's contacted the Independent Oversight Commission, secure upload capability, and someone who can guarantee that what I send gets in front of people who aren't part of this. She paused. Because if the deputy director on that floor had federal infrastructure oversight, we can't assume the contamination stops at his level. I have a contact, Riva said. Clean. Off-grid. She was already reaching for her phone. But if we do this, she looked at Damien. If we submit this documentation, there's no containing what comes after. The investigation will reach into Ashcroft. I know, he said. It'll reach into everything. I know that too. He looked at Zoraya. Do it. She began pulling this documentation together. Her hands were moving fast, systematically, the way they'd moved for 5 years building this empire's administration, except now she was doing the opposite. She was taking the walls apart. She was opening every sealed room and letting the light in, and she was doing it deliberately. And the feeling of it in her chest was something she had no prior category for. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. Something rawer than that. She was 30 minutes into the upload sequence when Riva's phone went off. The sound of it was wrong. The specific tone of Riva's emergency line, a frequency Zoraya had heard used exactly once in 5 years, during an event she'd processed the documentation for afterward and had never asked about directly. Riva looked at the screen. Her face did something. What? Damien said. Riva looked up. Breyer's not in the wind, she said. He's here. 3 blocks out. He's coming with 9 people and something else? She stopped. Held up the phone so Damien could see the message on the screen. He's got a federal authorization, a warrant, for the building, the equipment, and another stop. And, Damien said. And Zoraya, Riva said. He's got a federal warrant for Zoraya's arrest. Material witness in an organized crime investigation. She lowered the phone. Someone above the deputy director moved fast. Very fast. She looked at the upload screen. If he gets here before that finishes... The upload bar was at 63%. Zarya looked at it. Then she looked at the door. Then she looked at Damien, who was looking at her with the expression that had been present all evening. The readable one. The one she'd spent 5 years not letting herself examine. 63%. 9 men and a federal warrant 3 blocks away. And somewhere in the next 4 minutes, either the information got out, or it didn't. And everything that came after, for both of them, for the organization, for the 31 months of constructed betrayal and the people who'd funded it from inside federal infrastructure, everything lived or died in the gap between 63% and 100. She turned back to the screen. Lock the front entrance, she said. Buy me 4 minutes. Zoraya. 4 minutes, Damien? She was already typing, rerouting the upload through a secondary channel to increase the transfer rate. You wanted to protect me for 5 years. Do it now. 4 minutes. She heard him move. She heard the room compress into action around her. Riva on the phone, Nolan's voice from the corner, the specific sounds of a situation becoming something that didn't have a clean resolution on the other side. She watched the upload bar. 67, 71, 74. From outside the building, very close now, she heard vehicles. 78. The front entrance held. She heard it hold. Heard the impact of something against it. Heard voices outside. Heard Damien's voice from somewhere near the front of the building saying something she couldn't make out but could read by register. 83, 87. The door at the back of the operations room opened and Dex came through it, breathing hard. They're on the east side too. We have maybe 90 seconds before... 90 seconds is fine, she said. It wasn't fine. She had no idea if it was fine. 91, 94... She heard the front entrance give, 94%. The front entrance gave with a sound like a building exhaling, a long, grinding concession of metal and frame that Zoraya felt in her back teeth. She didn't look up from the screen. Looking up would cost her something she couldn't quantify, but knew she couldn't afford. 96. She could hear them in the building now. Controlled entry. Organized. Rehearsed. The sound of people who had done this before and had the authority to do it again. Not Breyer's men. Or not only Breyer's men. Federal. The particular acoustics of official force, which had a different quality than criminal force, more deliberate, more aware of documentation, more aware that every action was being logged somewhere for future review. 97. Damien's voice from the front of the building. She couldn't make out words. She heard the register. Controlled, not combative. The voice he used in negotiations when he'd already decided on his position and was letting the other party catch up to that fact at their own pace. 98. Riva appeared at her left shoulder, said nothing. Just appeared, and stood. And that was its own form of communication. 99. The operations room door opened. The man who came through first was in federal tactical gear, vest, badge displayed, one hand at his side, not on his weapon but near it. Behind him, two more. And then behind them, in a suit that was slightly too good for the hour and the context, Vance Breyer. He looked exactly the same as he had in the warehouse, neat, controlled. The silver hair, the expensive suit, the expression of a man performing the management of a situation. The upload bar hit 100%. She pressed send. Breyer was watching her face. He saw something in it. He was smart enough to see it, smart enough to understand in the half-second between what her fingers had done and what his next move was. And his expression shifted, just slightly, from managed control to something that had a fissure running through it. "Step away from the terminal," the lead federal agent said. His voice was professional and carried no particular malice, which made it worse in a specific way. Zoraya put her hands flat on the table and stood up slowly, the way you stood up when you were communicating that you were not a threat and also were not afraid. Both at once. She'd never done this before in a literal sense, but she'd done the emotional equivalent in boardrooms for 5 years, and the body language was identical. "The upload is complete," she said. To Breyer. Not to the agents. To Breyer specifically because he was the one she wanted to be looking at her face when she said it. "Everything I sent is now in the possession of 3 independent recipients. The Oversight Commission, a sealed federal judiciary contact, and a journalist at a national outlet whose track record on federal corruption is about 20 years of not being intimidated." She kept her voice even. "The warrant you're holding doesn't change what's already in transit." Breyer looked at her. The fissure in his expression widened by a fraction. "Whatever she's transmitted is fruits of—" He started, speaking to the agents. "It's documentation," she said calmly. "Financial records, communication logs, routing manifests, and a 31-month timeline of coordinated federal regulatory interference conducted by at least 2 individuals currently holding active federal appointments." She paused. "I didn't steal it. I compiled it from materials that passed through my authorized professional access over the course of 5 years. Every access is logged with my proper credentials and time-stamped." Another pause. "I'd be careful about how aggressively you pursue that warrant, because every attorney who looks at this is going to have the same question about why a federal office was in contact with Vance Breyer 22 months before the regulatory amendment he helped design." The lead agent had stopped moving. He was looking at Breyer now, just briefly, with the specific quality of a man doing a rapid recalculation. Breyer's face had gone very still. Damien came through the door behind the federal team. They didn't stop him. He'd clearly reached some kind of interim negotiation at the front of the building, the kind that bought just enough time without conceding anything permanent. He was moving with the controlled urgency of someone who'd been listening from the other side of a door and had timed his entrance to the second. He looked at the upload bar. He looked at Zoraya's face. She gave him a single, small nod. Something in his shoulders changed. Not released. Damien Varick didn't release, not in rooms like this, maybe not ever. But something adjusted. Something that had been held at maximum tension dropped by 1 degree. "My client," said a voice from behind the federal team, and everyone in the room turned, "has nothing further to say without legal counsel present." The woman who'd spoken was small, 50-something, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific unhurried authority of someone who had been in federal proceedings enough times to understand that urgency was almost always a manipulation. Zoraya had seen her face before, had processed her retainer agreement, in fact, filed 18 months ago under a legal services category she'd never had reason to access until this moment. Damien had called her while he was holding the front entrance. He'd called her and she'd arrived in— Zariah checked the time instinctively. 11 minutes, which meant she'd been nearby, which meant Damien had not been entirely unprepared for a scenario that ended with federal presence. She filed this away. Later. The next 40 minutes were the particular kind of chaos that looked like order from the outside. Agents moved through the operations room. The terminal was seized, the laptop, the external drive. Zariah watched them take it and felt nothing because the upload was complete, and what they took was a shell, a container whose contents were already elsewhere, and she'd had the presence of mind to wipe the local cache in the same motion as pressing send. She was formally read the material witness warrant. She listened to it with her hands clasped in front of her, standing in the emerald dress with the torn hem and the cold she still hadn't fully shaken, and she listened with the same attention she brought to every piece of documentation that had passed through her hands for 5 years. And when the agent finished, she said, clearly and without inflection, that she would comply fully with any legally valid process and that her attorney was present. Breyer was in the corner of the room speaking with 2 agents in low, rapid exchanges. She watched him from her peripheral vision without appearing to watch him, the way she watched most things. His composure was eroding at the edges. She could see it in the way his left hand moved, a subtle, repetitive press of his thumb against his index finger that she'd observed in meetings when he was under pressure and managing not to show it. He was calculating. She could see him calculating whether what she'd transmitted could be contained, whether the recipients could be discredited or delayed, whether the timeline of his exposure gave him any operational room to maneuver. She had thought about this too. She'd thought about it for 6 weeks. She'd sent the documentation to 3 recipients, which she'd told him. What she hadn't told him was that 2 of those 3 recipients had already confirmed receipt via automated response in the 12 seconds after she pressed send. She'd seen it in the bottom corner of the screen before the agents moved her away from the terminal. And the 3rd recipient, the journalist, had a publication history of moving on material within 4 hours of receipt when the source credibility was established. Her credibility was established. She was the authorized executive assistant of Ashcroft Global Holdings, with 5 years of documented access and a clean professional record. She was the last person anyone would construct as a disreputable source. Breyer had spent 31 months engineering this. She had spent 6 weeks dismantling it. The asymmetry felt important in a way she didn't have words for yet. They took her out of the building at 1 a.m, not in handcuffs. The attorney had been clear and immediate about that, and the lead agent had been reasonable, which suggested he was either genuinely operating in good faith or was experienced enough to understand that the optics of a material witness warrant executed in handcuffs on a professional black woman were a very specific kind of problem. She walked out on her own, with the attorney at her left side and 1 agent at a respectful distance, into the cold of the street. Damien was standing outside. They hadn't told him he could be there. He was simply there, on the sidewalk, in the October air without his jacket. And when she came through the door, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her outside the van. Directly, fully, without the management of expression that was usually his default. "I'll meet you," she said to him. "After." He nodded. He didn't try to say anything else. She understood this as the most significant form of restraint she'd ever seen from him. She got in the attorney's car. The next 7 hours were a specific category of experience that she would never describe to anyone in full. The kind of experience that existed in the exact space where institutional power met personal exposure, where every word was documented and every silence was also documented, and you had to be both completely accurate and strategically composed at the same time, for hours, while running on 3 hours of sleep from the night before and the accumulated physical cost of a night that had included a warehouse, a man with a metal rod, and a roll door she'd gone under on her knees. She answered every question. She produced documentation that she had memorized rather than stored on any device that could be seized. She walked 2 federal investigators through a timeline that connected Breyer's financial records to the regulatory amendment to specific routing decisions within Ashcroft's Meridian network. And she did it with the precise, unremarkable professionalism of a woman who had been building this case in her head for 6 weeks and had simply been waiting for a room where it would be heard. At 8:14 in the morning, Vance Breyer was taken into federal custody. The arresting charge was preliminary: obstruction, conspiracy, the kind of initial filing that served as a container for the larger case being built around it. But preliminary was enough. Preliminary meant the wall was breached. Preliminary meant that what she'd sent at 99%, in the 45 seconds before the door opened, had done what she'd needed it to do. She heard about it from the attorney, who received a call in the corridor while Zariah was drinking her third cup of bad coffee in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The attorney came in, sat across from her, and said, "Breyer's in custody. 2 federal officials have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The senator's office has issued a statement indicating full cooperation with authorities." A pause. "The journalist published 40 minutes ago." Zaria set down her coffee cup. "Okay," she said. The attorney looked at her for a moment. "Is that all you have to say?" "For right now." She looked at the window. Gray morning light, the specific washed-out quality of a city that had been awake all night without acknowledgement. "Yes." She walked out of this federal building at 9:30 in the morning in a torn emerald dress and heels she had now worn for 15 continuous hours, and the October air hit her like something she'd been waiting for. Damien was parked across the street, not in the armored Escalade, in a car she recognized from the pool, but that wasn't the one usually assigned to him. Smaller, less conspicuous, the kind of vehicle chosen by someone who wanted to be present without making a statement about it. He was in the driver's seat. He got out when he saw her. He looked like someone who hadn't slept. She supposed she did too. They stood on opposite sides of the street for a moment, with the morning traffic moving between them in its unremarkable Friday rhythm. Delivery trucks, early commuters, a cyclist who moved through the intersection without stopping. The city going on. Then the light changed. She crossed. They didn't embrace. That wasn't yet the shape of them. Maybe never would be. Maybe would become something else eventually, but right now it wasn't that. She stopped in front of him and he looked at her face with an attention that was different from his professional assessment look, different from the emergency damage check look, different from all the looks she'd cataloged over 5 years. This one was just looking. The kind of looking that doesn't have an agenda. "Breyer's in custody," she said. "I know. Riva told me." He paused. "Are you all right?" 4th time he'd asked her that tonight. Same question. Still not the same question. "Ask me in a week," she said. He nodded slowly. "Fair." She looked at him. In the gray morning light, he looked older than he did in the building. Not in a bad way, just in a truer way. The way people looked when the controlled environment of their professional context wasn't mediating the impression. He had lines around his eyes she'd noticed before, but had always categorized as incidental. They weren't incidental. They were the record of something. "I need to say something," she said. "Okay." "Not here." She glanced at the street. "Not on the sidewalk at 9:30 in the morning in this dress." Something moved across his face that was, she thought, the closest thing to humor she'd ever seen there. It didn't quite arrive as humor, but it passed through the territory. "Where?" "Somewhere I can sit down." She looked at her feet. "And change my shoes." They went to his secondary apartment, not the safe house, not the office, a place she'd processed the lease paperwork for 3 years ago and had never been invited into. It was smaller than she'd expected, which surprised her. She'd built an internal model of Damien Varick's private spaces based on the administrative footprint of his professional ones, and the model had been wrong. The apartment was spare and not particularly decorated, the kind of space that was lived in but not curated, and there was a kitchen that had actual food in it, which she noted with the detached interest of someone who has been awake for 24 hours and whose blood sugar is communicating its grievances. She sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee, actual coffee, not the institutional variety she'd been drinking for the last 7 hours, and set it in front of her without asking how she took it. Black. He remembered, or he'd paid attention at some point in 5 years, or both. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I'm leaving Ashcroft," she said. He was standing at the counter. He didn't react immediately. She watched him receive it, process it, run it through whatever architecture he used for things he hadn't prepared for. "Okay," he said. "I don't mean I'm angry, or—" She paused, reconsidered the sentence. "I am angry. I'm going to be angry for a while, I think. About the 5 years of—" She stopped again, started with a different entry point. "You made decisions about my life that weren't yours to make. You took something from me that you didn't have the right to take. And I don't think you can fix that by—" She gestured vaguely. By being sorry. By changing. Even if the change is real. I know, he said. Same quality as when he'd said it in the safe house kitchen. Not defensive, not deflecting, just receiving it. But leaving Ashcroft isn't about punishing you, she continued. It's about... She looked at the coffee. I spent 5 years being invisible inside your world. I was good at it. I was very good at it. But I built that invisibility partly because it was the job, and partly because it felt safer than being seen. She looked up. I don't want to be invisible anymore, and I can't figure out how to be visible inside the same structure where I spent 5 years learning to disappear. Damien was quiet for a moment. He came away from the counter and sat at the table, not across from her this time, at an angle, close. What will you do? He said. I have documentation of 31 months of federal corruption and a relationship with a journalist who just published the beginning of what's going to be a significant story. She curled both hands around the coffee mug. I think there are people who would find my particular skill set useful in contexts that don't involve encrypted shipping manifests. Consulting, he said, or oversight work. I haven't decided. She looked at him. I have options. I've always had options. I just spent 5 years behaving as if I didn't. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. I want to say something, he said, and I need you to let me say it without me trying to make it into something it isn't. She waited. I don't know exactly when it became what it was, he said. He was speaking carefully, with the specific care of someone who doesn't speak carefully as a rule and is applying unusual effort. I didn't start out thinking I was protecting you. I think I told myself that later because it was a version of the truth I could operate inside. He paused. The truth is that you were the only person in my life who was consistently more concerned with what was right than with what was expedient. And I couldn't lose that. And I didn't have any language for what that meant, so I did what I know how to do. He stopped. She looked at him. You controlled it, she said. Yes. Because you didn't know how to ask for it. I didn't know how to ask for anything, he said. I've never known how to ask for things. I built an organization specifically structured so that I wouldn't have to. The kitchen was quiet. Morning light was coming through the window now, stronger than the gray of an hour ago. The kind of light that was making a genuine attempt. That's not something I can fix for you, she said. I know. And I'm not going to stay inside Ashcroft waiting to see if you can fix it for yourself. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she'd been carrying for an unknown duration. She wasn't sure when she'd picked it up, whether it was years ago or months ago or somewhere in the compressed and terrible hours of the last night. Something that had sat below the professional layers and the anger and the competence and the carefully maintained armor of a woman who'd learned that invisibility was safer than exposure. Something that was its own kind of truth and that she was, for the first time, looking at directly. She wasn't going to say it today. It wasn't today's thing. Today was too loud with everything that had happened, and the saying of it deserved a quieter day. A day when neither of them was running on adrenaline and bad coffee and the wreckage of a night that had cost them both things they were still calculating. But she didn't look away from him, and she let him see that she wasn't looking away. I need to sleep, she said finally. You can... He stopped himself. Started again. The second room is... I'm going home, she said. My home. He nodded. She drank the rest of the coffee. It was very good. She noted this without sentiment. She stood, picked up her heels from where she'd set them under the chair, and walked to the door in her bare feet on his floor. At the door she stopped and turned because there was one more thing. The organization, she said. What it becomes after this. After the investigation and the exposure, and whatever restructuring happens. She held his gaze. That's a choice you're going to make, and I'm not going to be there to manage the consequences of it or route the documentation or make it function while you figure it out. A pause. So make it carefully. He looked at her across the small kitchen of the apartment that was nothing like she'd imagined. I will, he said. She believed him. She wasn't certain she was right to believe him, but she believed him. She left. The street outside was fully morning now. The city was doing what cities did, filling itself back up with the ordinary commerce of a day that had no knowledge of the night that had preceded it. People moved on sidewalks. Delivery trucks doubled parked. A woman walked a dog that stopped to investigate something invisible in a doorway. The sky was a pale blue that would deepen later, the kind of fall sky that apologized for nothing. Zariah stood on the sidewalk in a torn emerald dress and bare feet, carrying her heels in her left hand, and she looked at the city for a long moment. She thought about the elevator. She thought about saying no and watching the doors close and the particular quality of her hands in the moment after. The stillness, the surprise at the stillness. She thought about the woman in the bathroom mirror, the one she'd looked at for a long time before she left for Harlow and Reed. She thought about the word she'd given that woman, the private word she'd said in her own head before she turned off the light. Enough. You are enough. You have always been enough. She thought about a metal rod in a dark corridor and bolt cutters and 99% and pressing a button in a warehouse because there was nothing else to press. She thought about 6 weeks of documentation built quietly, incrementally, in the part of her professional capacity that no one watched because no one had ever thought to watch it. She thought about Riva saying you got all of that from building permits with a kind of restrained respect that Zariah had filed and would take out later, in a quieter moment, and look at properly. She put her heels on. She walked to the corner and raised her hand for a car, and when it came she got in and told the driver her address. Her address, the apartment she'd chosen and furnished and maintained in the years she'd been at Ashcroft. The space that was entirely hers in a way that nothing else had been. In the car, she took out her phone, the personal one, 4 contacts. She added a 5th. She'd been given the number by the journalist's assistant at 7:40 that morning, pressed on a card across a conference table, with a look that said, "This is not a small story, and you are not a small source." She'd put the card in the pocket of her torn dress and kept it there. She looked at the number now. Didn't call it. Not yet. Not today. But she saved it under the journalist's name, and the act of doing that was itself a kind of declaration. The kind you made quietly, without audience, without ceremony. The kind that mattered because you made it for yourself and no other reason. The car moved through the city. She looked out the window and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of being in her own life. Not adjacent to it, not managing it from a distance, not hiding inside the infrastructure of someone else's world. Her own life, with its complications and its damage and its unresolved questions, and the particular things that were going to take time, the anger that was going to take time, the things she'd need to look at in the quieter days that were coming. Her own life. She watched the city move past. She let her shoulders down from where they'd been living, somewhere near her ears, for approximately 15 continuous hours. She breathed. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, she went back to Ashcroft Global Holdings. Not to work. She went to collect the things in her office that were hers. A photograph she kept in the bottom drawer. A book she'd been midway through for 2 months. A small ceramic plant pot that had survived 4 years on the windowsill and 1 organizational restructuring. She went in the afternoon, deliberately, when the floor would be moderately populated and her presence would require no particular acknowledgement. She was wearing a dress, not the emerald one, that was at the back of her closet, clean, repaired at the knee by a tailor who had asked no questions. A different one, burgundy, the kind of color that also didn't apologize. The floor was quieter than it had been. The investigation had moved through the organization like weather, necessary, disruptive, the kind of thing that changed what was standing afterward. Several people were gone. The operations structure was being rebuilt, from what she understood, by a team that Damien had assembled with unusual deliberateness. She went to her office, packed her 3 things into a bag, and looked around the space for a moment. 10 by 12, the glass partition, the view of the executive corridor that she'd watched for 5 years without ever fully inhabiting. She looked at it without sentiment, without ceremony. She just looked at it for a moment, the way you looked at something you were leaving cleanly, without drama, without the need to perform the ending. Then she went to leave and she met Damien in the corridor. He was coming from the direction of his office. He was wearing the kind of clothes that didn't match the building. A jacket she'd never seen, slightly less formal than his usual. He looked like a man who was in the process of becoming something that hadn't fully arrived yet. She understood this. She was too. They stopped in the corridor. "You came," he said. "For my things." He looked at the bag, nodded. There was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It had been 3 weeks and they'd spoken twice in that time, briefly, about practical matters, and those conversations had been careful and honest and had not tried to resolve anything that wasn't ready to be resolved. He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket she didn't recognize. What he produced was small. She saw it before he opened his hand fully. The specific color, the specific quality of the stone. A green she recognized in her own body before her eyes finished processing the image. An emerald ring. Simple setting, nothing extravagant. The stone a deep and unapologetic green that matched nothing in this building and belonged entirely to the outside world. He held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "To the job. To any of this." A pause. "I'm not asking you to forgive things that aren't forgivable yet." Another pause. "I'm asking if there's a version of the future where I've earned the right to be in the same room as you. Not here. Somewhere that's yours." He held her gaze with the specific directness that was the one thing about him that had never been managed or performed. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at the ring for a long moment. She thought about all the ways this could be wrong. She was good at cataloging ways things could be wrong. It was, in many respects, her professional expertise. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the 5 men and the phone calls and the quiet, systematic clearing of the margins of her life by a man who hadn't known how to ask for what he wanted. She thought about the elevator. She thought about what it had cost her to say no and what it had given her. She thought about 99% and a warehouse floor and a bolt cutter and the journalist's number in her phone. She thought about the fact that she was still here, that she had chosen to be here, not because she was needed, not because the machinery required her, but because she had a bag of her things and she was collecting them, and she was at every point in this making her own decision. She took the ring. She didn't put it on. She held it in her palm and looked at it and felt its weight, which was slight and real, and then she closed her fingers around it. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. He looked at her hand, closed around the ring, and something moved across his face that she had a name for now. It had taken her a while to find the name. It wasn't love in the way that word usually arrived, all front-loaded and declarative. It was the other kind, the kind that had been there for a long time without permission, that had expressed itself badly and at great cost, and that was now standing in a corridor with nothing left to hide behind. "Okay," he said. She put the ring in the pocket of the burgundy dress. She picked up her bag. She walked down the corridor past the glass partition of the office she'd spent 5 years inhabiting, past the potted plants that were still sad and still surviving, to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She stepped in, turned, and looked back down the corridor. Damien was still standing where she'd left him, not following, not calling after her, just standing in the hallway of the empire that was becoming something different, watching her go with the expression of a man who had finally learned the difference between holding on and letting someone choose. The doors closed. She breathed out slowly. The elevator descended, and Zariah Coleman, who had once been invisible inside the machinery of another person's world, rode down 42 floors into a city that was entirely her own, with a ring in her pocket and 6 months ahead of her, and the particular hard-won knowledge of a woman who had walked into the fire and come out the other side still standing, still choosing, still entirely and completely herself.